My name's Catherine Gough, and I'm a professor of human geography at Loughborough University. Youth employment has been one of my key research areas for the past around 6 to 7 years. And there's basically no doubt that youth employment, or we could also say unemployment, is currently one of the key global challenges. Basically, if jobs are scarce, then it's young people who tend to be those who are the hardest hit. Partly because they lack work experience that older people have, and also they may be the first people to actually be fired. This situation is severe around the world, but it's particularly acute in many countries in the global south. And in these sorts of countries, even for highly educated young people, it can be extremely difficult to actually manage to find a job. It's generally accepted that youth unemployment is around 4 times that of adults. If we look around the world, young people make up a considerable proportion of the population, and in a global south context, they make up around 1/3 of the total population. But only an absolute minority of these young people will actually succeed in managing to obtain some form of employment in the formal sector. And by this, we mean people who are getting a job that's officially registered, that's official waged work. Consequently, many of them become employed in the informal sector. And in this situation, they're often employed in quite poor conditions. They tend to have very low pay, and this pay may be very irregular. So I've come across many young people who've worked for days, weeks, even months with promises of payment, but never actually received any payment. Others who are earning very low amounts of money, only just enough to basically survive. So consequently, young people tend to be very wary of being employed informally, will try and avoid it if they can. And they tend to, if they can, try and create their own employment. And by this, we talk about young people becoming young entrepreneurs. And to illustrate this, I want to talk about, or illustrate it through some examples of a research project that I led that was about young entrepreneurs in Ghana, Uganda, and Zambia. To clarify, when we use the term entrepreneurship, we're using it in quite a broad context. We define it as the ability to spot and seize an opportunity to establish a business and in the process take risks and manage the available resources creatively. It's basically any person who's seizing an opportunity, taking a risk and setting up a business. There's a lot of research on entrepreneurship around the world, and levels of entrepreneurship vary greatly, and it depends on the social context, the economic, the political, and very much also on the cultural context. In sub-Saharan Africa, levels of entrepreneurship are around the highest of many countries around the world. And in the research we conducted under the umbrella of the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, we found that around 4 out of 10 young people actually are running a business. So what we found is that whereas previously young people would be very much seeking to obtain formal sector employment, nowadays they're actually seeing self-employment as sometimes actually being the preferred option for employment. What we're seeing are really quite positive attitudes to self-employment, and also young people rate their own abilities to set up a business really quite highly. What we see, though, is that whereas a lot of young people set up businesses, these businesses tend to only have relatively short lifespans. A lot of them won't last more than a few years at the maximum. And they tend to remain at really quite a micro level. They tend to enter into businesses where there's really quite a high level of competition. There's a limited number of businesses they tend to set up. The amount of money they earn can be really quite limited, and very few of them have any employees. Maybe some of them have 1 or 2, but basically they're run by themselves, sometimes with the help of unpaid family labour. Often young people find that even if their business does start to be successful, that the money they're generating, it can be very difficult to plough that back into the business because there's so many demands on their finances. And so if their business starts doing well, then there are siblings they need to support, there are health issues, there's all sorts of calls on their finance. So it can be difficult for them to put the money back into the business. We found that within the sub-Saharan African countries, both young men and women are setting up businesses. Generally worldwide, there are more men running businesses than women. One exception is one of the countries we're working in, which is Ghana, where in fact female rates of entrepreneurship are actually higher than male rates of entrepreneurship. There's a long story behind this, but basically it's historically rooted, and it dates back to women being active in trading right way back to pre-colonial times. But it's just important to recognize that when we talk about an entrepreneur, we're not just talking about young men, we're also talking about young women as well. When we think of rural areas, we tend to think of farming, and most people living in rural areas will be engaged in some form of farming, but it's rarely actually their only activity. There's a lot of discussion in the literature at the moment about the fact that farming is generally seen not as being a favourable employment for young people to enter. And so there's a lot of discussion about how can we make young people more interested in farming, get them more involved. What we found in our research was that it actually varies by context. So we found, in fact, that in a Zambian context, young people are in fact entering into farming. They do actually see it as being a profitable enterprise. Less so in a less so in a Ghanaian and in a Ugandan context. There's all sorts of factors that lie behind this. It depends on availability of land. It depends on other opportunities for employment. It depends on government policies, subsidies, etc. But even if young people are involved in farming, it's rarely their only activity. And we found that in rural areas, it's young people who are often the ones who are the first to seize initiatives as they rise to set up various non-farm businesses. So we see young people setting up, typically in trading, so setting up small businesses where they're buying and selling food, where they're offering some basic services. And this can be highly influenced by the availability of infrastructure. So, for example, if a village has electricity or electricity arrives in a village, this increases the types of businesses people can actually run. We also found that mobility is a key strategy of young people. And young people tend to be the most mobile. And often when they're engaging in mobility, it's because they're seeking better opportunities for earning an income. And we found that particularly in the Ghanaian context, all the young people who were living in the rural area, they'd all left the area, they'd moved to an urban area, they'd earned some money in the urban area and then come back and were investing that either in farming or in a business back in the rural area. And what I want to emphasize is that often it's thought that if young people leave a rural area, this is actually a negative thing, but it's not necessarily. It's not necessarily negative if young people leave rural areas. It's a key part of their livelihood strategies, and some of them will return and invest the money they earn elsewhere back in the rural area. And some of them will engage in mobility really on a quite regular basis, depending on the time of year, working either in a rural area or within an urban context. So basically, young people living in rural areas typically are combining farming, non-farm activities, and also are engaging in migration. And linked to this, it's important to emphasize that I'm talking about rural areas. I'm now going to say something about urban areas, but the distinction between the two is far from clear-cut. And also young people will move between the two, so you can't necessarily categorize young people as either rural or as urban. So moving on to urban areas. Within urban areas, as I say, in the countries we worked in within sub-Saharan Africa, we've got around somewhere around 30 to 40% of young people running a business. The types of businesses they run will vary. Trading is a very common business. Services is also a sector of the economy young people tend to enter into. What we see in an urban context is that the type of businesses young people set up tend to be highly gendered. So we find women setting up, a lot of women engage in trading. Women in services will be typically engaging in hairdressing as seamstresses. They're the key occupations for young women. For young men, there's a much wider range of businesses. They will also be engaged in trading, but also in terms of services, they will be doing things like auto mechanics, repairing all sorts of electronic goods. They may be washing cars. What we see though for particularly young men, but also for young women, is that sometimes they will have one business, but they may also have multiple businesses. So for example, a woman who's a seamstress may also sell oranges. or a young man who's a car mechanic may also have a car washing business on the side. So either they may run more than one business at a point in time, or they may have one business for a short period of time and then seize an opportunity in another business, and therefore one business may fail but they set up another business. And there's this term that's become used in the literature that we've also used that we call zigzagging. So this idea that young people will zigzag between different opportunities, seizing them as they arise. There's a great degree of insecurity in young people's employment, whether this is formal employment, informal employment, or whether it's in the business that they're actually running. And one of the problems with youth employment insecurity is that it's highly linked to other aspects of insecurity in their lives. So what we find is that if something else happens in their life, so the death of a parent, or a parent losing employment, or it may be somebody losing access to housing, it may be having to drop out of education. There's all sorts of aspects of young people's lives that are highly insecure. And insecurity in one aspect of their life highly influences insecurity in other aspects of their lives. And this means that the employment insecurity becomes reinforced by insecurity in other aspects of their lives, and vice versa. The final thing I want to mention is efforts to promote youth employment entrepreneurship. What we've seen in recent years is a real mushrooming of initiatives to support youth entrepreneurship. And this has been from a range of institutions. It's been from NGOs, from governments, from a wide range of different aid organisations, but a lot of it has been very small scale, uncoordinated, piecemeal, and really quite limited in scope. So in fact, in all the research we conducted, we never met one young person who had benefited from any of the schemes that were running, and most of them were totally unaware of the schemes. Those that were aware of the schemes would typically claim that you would have to know someone in order to actually benefit from such schemes. Also, these sorts of schemes tend to support young people in terms of actually establishing a business in the first place. And what we found is that young people are typically really quite capable of setting up their own business. They have more difficulties actually maintaining the business, trying to keep it running. So what we would argue is that young people need just as much support in actually maintaining the business rather than for the actual initial startup. And really what we can see is there's a need for the sort of programs that are being run to be depoliticized, to be better coordinated, to recognize diversity amongst young people. And basically there's a need to adopt a more holistic approach to youth and youth employment. Because there is a danger that if we just say that what we need to do is support youth entrepreneurship, that this is really abdicating responsibility and saying, well, you know, young people just have to solve their own employment problem. They have to set up their own business. What we need to see wider ranging policies that aim at stimulating job generating, inclusive and sustainable growth, as well as just promote youth entrepreneurship.